What's going on, guys? This is Empty Box, and it's finally time for me to talk about the iRacing Spec Racer Ford once again, because the Spec Racer received a massive update in this recent build that changed everything entirely. It's quite literally a new car in every way that isn't a graphics model, which still remains present from like 2008, 2007, 2006, a long time ago. Apparently my dog thought that was worth celebrating. Now, given the Spec Racer is my favorite car in iRacing, even if I don't race it as much as I should, I want to go ahead and talk about this one a little bit more because, you know, it's a special car for me. So let's answer the question right out of the gates. Did iRacing ruin my favorite car? The answer is yes, it's dead. The old car is gone. Gone is that slow, quirky bathtub with swivel caster wheels. It does not exist. The name of the game now is left foot braking, auto blipping, sequential manuals with something resembling ample horsepower. Yeah, this is an entirely different experience. The old car is dead. Press F in the chat for the old SRF. Ye will be missed. Now, is that actually a bad thing? And does that mean that this is automatically worse? The answer is no. Another fact that my dog wishes to celebrate. So the new Spec Racer Ford is rebuilt to the Generation 3 specs, which means that the engine, transmission, tires are all new. iRacing also went ahead and lifted the dashboard display, the DigiDash, off of the MX-5 and dropped it into this car, which means that you now have shift lights, which is a welcome addition after so much time with a tachometer that was placed in a position that only if you were running a 120-degree field of view on a single screen you would ever possibly actually see it half of the time, at least in the useful part of the rev range, which was right at the bottom of the tachometer. So hallelujah on that. That is actually a very, very welcome update. First impression with this new updated car was one of, holy cow, it's fast. While not really that fast in the grand scheme of things, if you're coming from a perspective based on the old Spec Racer, you'll probably have your mind blown when you start hitting 120 plus miles an hour by yourself in the Spec Racer Ford regularly. I've done over 140 miles an hour in the draft. It feels like Mach speeds comparatively. And the experience really starts with the engine. The new engine is good for around 30% more horsepower than the previous car. Not to mention that this engine likes to actually rev up, as opposed to the previous engine, which felt like you wanted to short shift it all the time because comparatively, yeah, you did. You didn't want to rev that thing out. This one actually revs, and it likes to be revved. No more school bus engine. Additional benefit to this updated engine is it is significantly lighter in weight, which means that the car is also lighter in weight, as well as the fact that the weight balance has shifted a little bit further forward, which again, ain't gonna hurt things on this car. The other half of the very, very, very obvious experience of, whoa, speed, is the new transmission, which has now gone from a 5-speed H-pattern manual gearbox to a 6-speed sequential with auto blip. From a sim racing perspective, this is now basically 100% the same as a GT3 car and an F1 car. It does everything for you, and that's that, which is, well, it is what it is, but it is unfortunate. This is kind of controversial because apparently right now in the real world, the class is kind of in a bit of a flux situation where the 6-speed sequential is going to become the standard, I believe, next year within the class. But right now things are kind of mixed, as well as the auto blipping aspect isn't something that is commonly seen currently in the real world, but is something that is coming to the cars in the future. So iRacing is really just getting ahead of the curve here. So that's why they've made this change. It's not some sort of grand conspiracy to eliminate the H-pattern shifter from the world, like some people on the forums insinuated, which is a hilarious thread. But yeah. Fortunately, in my opinion, it doesn't really matter because the old Spec Racer Ford, yeah, sure, H-patterns are fun, but that engine was so dang boring anyways because that thing hated revs with a passion that it just wasn't a particularly enjoyable experience in terms of, you know, yeah, revs and you shift and all that stuff and skipping gears. It didn't really happen in that thing. But let's go ahead and get to the cornering bit because as the tires are new, the brakes are new, this has also changed pretty substantially, although it isn't as blisteringly obvious as the engine is, largely because by the time you get to the first corner to feel the cornering changes, you'll be like, whoa, what's this? This is different. But first of all, let's go ahead and start with the thing that defined the old iRacing car, and that would be lift-off oversteer. anyone who isn't familiar with the old SRF and iRacing would say that there's still some hints of liftoff oversteer. However, if you're a Spec Racer 4 diehard, well, it doesn't exist. It is now much more akin to, if I lift out, I get some extra rotation on the car rather than make no sudden movements or end up in the fence type of experience. It's still a much more user-friendly experience than the uninitiative, and definitely an adjustment from the old car. Now you actually need to use the brakes to rotate the car rather than off-throttle behavior, creating more than enough rotation on demand. And that's one of the key areas that I feel is substantially different between this car and the old car. I feel like this car really wants to be driven hard into the corners, smoothly still. It is still a momentum car, it still is a car that rewards smoothness, but it really comes to life when you start pushing those brake zones harder and harder and harder and really getting your trail braking and pushing on it. The thing comes to life, whereas the old Spec Racer Ford, it didn't do that. It stayed a bathtub because it was a bathtub with swivel caster wheels, and that's why I refer to it as such. Now the fun thing is, this car now has slick tires on it, which might sound like it'd be a really big adjustment, and apparently in the real world it was a pretty substantial adjustment in terms of how fast these cars can actually go through corners. But apparently the iRacing car previously was a little bit too fast in the corners, was a good bit too fast in the corners, which basically means that we got grippier tires now, but we really don't have all that much more grip than we had. So this is basically Spec Racer Ford with more power, which is not a bad thing at all. On corner exit, this car does still understeer a good bit. However, I don't know if it's just a combination of the way the car rotates and getting through the corner, or if something with the car and the tires itself really resulted in this change, because it's really hard for me to tell because it is such a substantial difference in the way you can drive the car. The understeer is a lot less problematic. Beforehand, you know, if you get into the throttle too early in the Spec Racer and the previous car, you were you were in full boat mode and you were just going to understeer off the track, and that was just going to be the way that it was. Whereas this car, yes, it understeers on the power, but at the same time, it's a lot less problematic. Overall, the Spec Racer Ford is the most balanced that it's ever been in iRacing as far as I am concerned. And best of all, this car still maintains those absolute butt-clenching moments when the car starts to ride the line of over-rotating. And that is one of my favorite parts in this car, because it constantly feels like you're almost gonna die, but as long as you're doing things right, well, that's where the speed is. This car really went from being a case of smooth on top of smooth on top of smooth on top of smooth is basically the only way to go, to smoothness and aggression are the way to go. It's almost kind of sort of like a formula car or a prototype car, only mini-me version now as opposed to a bathtub. So that's why I say the Spec Racer Ford has been ruined, because that experience of the old Spec Racer Ford, as far as I'm concerned, is entirely unrecognizable here in this configuration. But again, that's not a bad thing at all. In fact, I would say that this car is a load more fun to drive, and it's a lot more rewarding to drive as well, because when you really start pushing on the thing and getting your braking right and really start pushing your limits, then the car actually responds, as opposed to the previous iteration of the car and the vast majority of cars in iRacing as far as I'm concerned, where it just kind of mashed potatoes. Wrapping things up here, this is why I can confidently say that iRacing ruined my favorite car, because the experience that I enjoyed with my favorite car is no more. It doesn't really exist, even if people might think, oh hey, well, you know, it's just an updated Spec Racer Ford. It's basically the same, right? You know, it's just slightly better. It's borderline unrecognizable. Entirely different experience in any other way other than the way the car looks, as well as it's still a Spec Racer Ford, so it's still going to race like nobody's business. On that note, you want to have some fun, iRacing AI, big grids in the Spec Racer Ford, it's an instant party. I just want to go ahead and cap on a personal note of my relationship with this car here in iRacing. Back in 2008, I hated this car with an absolute passion. The thing was a death trap that had so much liftoff oversteer, it made the old car look like an absolute dump truck. Like, if you even thought about having anything other than the slowest right foot in the car way back when, you were going to have a bad time. Back in 2013, there was an update, an overhaul to the car, and word started getting around on the forums, and it kind of became one of those things where there was a couple of guys that were just like, hey, You should race the Spec Racer Ford. Spec Racer Ford surprisingly good. And as a word of mouth thing, eventually I ended up taking a look at the Spec Racer Ford, and ever since then it's been my favorite car in iRacing, even if it isn't necessarily my most raced car in iRacing, because it is that swivel caster bathtub thingamajigger with no horsepower, and the racing is at times absolutely ridiculous, and it flies under the radar because it gets no respect. You know, even within this update, you know, iRacing released a free Formula V, which is, you know, 90% of the same type of experience that you get with the old Spec Racer Ford at the same time, just to steal the spotlight off of this updated car, as well as the fact that they go to the effort to update this car substantially, but yet you can still see in replay cameras the graphics model that dates back to like 2006, if not further, probably, when iRacing was in like deep beta. Like, it's ridiculous. I mean, the steering wheel is literally 12-sided in the replay cameras, and you can't help but not notice it every single time. It's ridiculous that they didn't even fix that, because they just don't care about this car, because no one cares about this car. But gosh darn it, I care about this car. So race the Spec Racer Ford. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed. Bye.